believe what you're being told. It's a pack of lies from start to finish. It's intended to make you fearful and compliant.
In the age of COVID-19, uncertainty and fear has become a part of everyday life, whether that's the fear of a virus or fear of an experimental vaccine. You may be feeling uncomfortable taking off the mask at work. Perhaps your child is asking you questions about the vaccine, or maybe your employer is relaxing social distancing guidelines and you think it may be too soon. Yet, information surrounding COVID-19 is heavily suppressed. But how does this serve the public when we all want answers? I'm independent journalist Taylor Hudak, and to learn more about the COVID-19 vaccine, its safety, as well as the use of the vaccine on children and how it can possibly impact male and female fertility, today I speak with Dr. Roger Hodkinson. Dr. Hodkinson is a medical specialist in pathology and graduate of Cambridge University in the UK. He is a fellow of the College of American Pathologists and the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. He was previously the president of the Alberta Society of Laboratory Physicians and an assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Alberta. Dr. Hodkinson has also worked in public health advocacy for many years as honorary chairman of ASH, or Action on Smoking and Health, which is the leading nonprofit organization in Canada tackling the predatory marketing practices of big tobacco. Dr. Roger Hodkinson, it is a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for spreading the truth.
So before we get started, can you outline for us your medical credentials and qualifications?
Well, without wishing to be exhaustive and seeming pompous, my medical degrees were from Cambridge in Britain. I think they're a bit snotty, frankly, so I've never actually framed them. I trained in pathology in Vancouver, British Columbia. Since then, I've done a great deal of, had a number of positions in organized medicine. I've been an assistant professor at the University of Alberta. I've done a lot of resident teaching. I've been the chairman of the examination committee for the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Ottawa, setting the annual examination for pathologists to make sure that they're safe. To read your breast biopsies, it's a rather important role, maintaining quality in the profession. I've been the president of the Alberta Society of Laboratory Physicians, which means pathologists. I've been the CEO of a large community laboratory, cranking out all the numbers and tests for your GPs and specialists. We're the guys behind the scenes that create all the numbers and test results, and that included, of course, infectious disease and virology. I spent 20 years of my career in an unpaid honorary chairman role, taking on big tobacco as honorary chairman of ASH, Action on Smoking and Health. And for that reason, that was my, you might say, down dirty education in the politics of public health, which I've lived for 20 years, and I'm acutely familiar with how, you might say, the system works, and how that's translated into the mess that we're currently experiencing. In addition to all of that, I've done so many other roles. I don't wish to overload this.
Okay. Let's start talking about the COVID-19 virus and the measures that have been implemented to prevent its spread for over the past year. The media and politicians have many people very afraid about this virus. Is there a reason to be concerned and worried?
There's no need to have the degree of fear that they're trying to constantly amplify. The virus is not a hoax. The virus is real. It's been cultured and sequenced. That conspiracy theory is totally erroneous. What is a hoax is the way politicians playing medicine have reacted to this reality because the scale of threat for the working well and for children is similar to that of previous flu epidemics, if not less. The only demographic that is being discriminated against disproportionately are, of course, the elderly people in nursing homes, long care homes, who have comorbidities. But even with them, although the risk is higher, the risk of death is higher than with the flu, probably 3 to 4 times as high, it's still in absolute numbers a very survivable event. Your risk of surviving an attack of the flu in that age group with comorbidities is 99%, whereas the survivability of COVID in that age group is about 96%. I think you can see that the vast majority of people, even in that demographic, are surviving a COVID infection, even if that is a legitimate COVID infection, and we can cover that later on as to the diagnostic test and all its inadequacies. So, in other words, it's in the grand scheme of things, it's another flu, which we managed perfectly adequately in years gone by with personal responsibility, without any testing or doctor's involvement or government involvement of any kind. And that's exactly, of course, how we should be responding this time.
Let's talk about the testing. You have said in the past that positive test results do not mean a clinical infection. Why is that? And is this testing mechanism reliable?
Well, that's a two-part question. The PCR test is detecting a certain sequence of RNA in your nose that is categorical for we call it a signature sequence. If you find that sequence of RNA in your nose, that means you have that bit of the virus in your nose. There are two things that come out of that. First of all, finding it does not mean to say that you have an infection going on. It could simply mean that the virus is residing in your nose. You might have had COVID a couple of weeks ago, and it's the leftover debris of that infection that's positive. But more importantly, if you're talking about testing asymptomatic people who are feeling perfectly well, which is, of course, the vast bulk of testing that's going on right now, the false positive rate approaches 90% when the test is done inappropriately with a number of cycle times, as you might have heard, that is in excess of what is recommended. The false positive rate is at least 50%, and in many labs in the States, because of the enormous bonanza for labs doing the testing and cranking up the cycle times to create positives, that false positive rate probably approaches 90%. So it's a lousy test. It's wrong more often than right. And finding it does not mean that you have an infection in your nose. It simply means that even if it's correct, it's merely finding a portion of the virus in your nose.
Can you explain to us what a case is?
Yes, gladly, because the English language is being distorted here. There are lies and distortions and exaggerations at every turn, all designed to maintain fear as opposed to assuage fear. In clinical medicine, we call a case someone who is obviously sick in front of you. For whatever, they've got pain, they've got a fever, they're obviously sick. That is what we call a case. We do not call in clinical medicine a case someone who happens to have a single laboratory abnormality. That's not a case. That's an abnormal laboratory result. And to conflate the two is, again, sleight of hand, intentional, trying to create and support a crisis that really does not exist. And there are many further examples of that, but that is one of the biggest things that's maintaining fear You see the graph rising in the morning paper, quite apart from the additional scare of mutants, which we can cover separately. But the rising graph of these so-called positives is one of the main drivers of fear, which in itself drives a public that's not educated in the counter-narrative. That fear gets translated into the desire to take the vaccine. And the vaccine, of course, as we will talk about, is unsafe by any definition. But create fear, and you amplify the strength of the message to essentially intimidate people into getting vaccinated. So if I could paint a really big picture here as to what's been going on with governments internationally, they have created a very artificial crisis from the get-go. Totally artificial, not an emergency, which we can discuss as to why it's not an emergency. They created an emergency, and then they have the gall to turn around and say, you can only get us off this hook that we created, that we're desperately struggling to get off because it's untenable. We're only going to get you, we're only allow you to get off this hook if you take the vaccine. So they created the problem artificially, and then they turn around to say, we're only going to stop this stupidity, not going to apologize unless you help us by submitting your body to an experimental vaccine. Now that's double jeopardy. That's despicable manipulation of the public in an intentional way by politicians internationally.
We will discuss the COVID-19 vaccines shortly here, but first I want to talk about the measures that have been implemented over the past year. Is there any scientific basis for masks and for lockdowns?
Let me summarize the nature of all these interventions very simply, and we can go down each one of them separately. It's very important for your listeners to remember, if nothing else, what I'm now going to say. Nothing works. I'll repeat that. Nothing works. Underlined in neon. Nothing has worked in the past, and nothing will work in the future. There is no evidence for the principal interventions which are being proposed, namely masks, social distancing, travel bans, and lockdowns. There's no empirical evidence for them to work. In fact, quite the contrary. There's a huge amount of evidence to show that masks could not and do not work. There's a mountain of evidence now showing that the hurt created by lockdowns has grossly exceeded any potential benefit. Social distancing has been shown to be an inappropriate mandate because of the growing realization that this condition is not just spread by droplets, which land quickly within a few feet of you, if you happen to be coughing, which of course most people are not, but aerosols are being created in internal spaces. So that means when you're walking down an aisle in Walmart and you don't see anyone in that aisle, you're at risk walking down that aisle, whether you're wearing a mask or not. So masks do not work. Social distancing does not work. Lockdowns have enormous harm and very little, if any, benefit. In other words, pulling all those threads together, I think you can see the rationale for my statement. Nothing works. Medicine in 2021, despite all its sophistication, of which I'm a part, and very proud of the advances of modern medicine, but we are impotent, totally impotent, at controlling the spread of a pandemic with an upper respiratory tract infection, a virus causing that, such as the flu. In previous years, it was impossible to contain the flu. What we did as responsible individuals was do it ourselves. If we were sick, we stayed home. We had chicken noodle soup, we sprinkled it with Tylenol, we went to bed, we sweated it out, We had no need for testing of any kind, no need for government intervention of any kind. When we felt well, we went back to work because we designated ourselves as well. Again, no testing of any kind with the flu. In the process of all of this, of course, someone brought us chicken noodle soup. And sadly, we gave the infection to our family. Not intentionally, but it happened. And that was a good thing because it helped to build herd immunity the natural way without a vaccine, because being exposed to the flu in a family setting, you're exposed to the intact virus, not a portion of the virus, as is presently going on with these various vaccines. So natural transmission is undoubtedly the best way to build the best form of herd immunity. It's cheap, it's immediately available, and it's substantially less risky than an experimental vaccine.
Let's talk about these COVID-19 vaccines. Can you explain to us how this vaccine works and how it differs from a traditional vaccine?
I don't think it's worth trying to explain why some people are saying these are not vaccines. It's a very artificial argument. It's a way of creating immunity. Let's leave it at that. They're very clever. They're miraculous in many ways. It's a tremendous tribute to medical science to get it to this point. But they do differ substantially from all previous vaccines that have ever been used in humans, because this is a portion of the COVID-19 virus, which is very cleverly encapsulated in a membrane that's intended to fuse with certain cells in your lymph nodes in your armpit. So you get injected into your arm with this, we'll call it a vaccine. That travels up in the lymphatics from your muscle. Nothing happens in the muscle. It's merely a safe place to put it. That then travels up in the lymphatic system to the lymph nodes in your armpit, where a certain cell called a dendritic cell is programmed to detect anything that's foreign, including these particles. It enters that cell, which is the manufacturing base, the factory, if you like, for the production within that dendritic cell of the spike protein in large amount. That's then expressed on the surface of that cell after it's been produced, and it's taken up by immediately adjacent cells in the lymphoid system in order to have them react to it in the two arms of the immune response, the immunoglobulins, the antibodies, if you like, on the one hand, and the cellular immunity, the humoral reaction with the T cells at the same time. The two arms of the immune system are then triggered. That is the ideal situation that was intended. Unfortunately, the history of the development of RNA vaccines, which, by the way, have been tried many times and all failed because of various toxicity and adverse effects. One of the biggest problems that they had was what we call dose. How much of the stuff should we inject? And, we don't just look differently. Our genetic composition is different. The ability of our lymphatic system is different. And so some people will massively overproduce these spike proteins, some of which will escape into the general circulation. And only 3 days ago, was that proven for the first time, that indeed the spike protein is leaking out into the peripheral blood. Once it gets there in sufficient concentration, it is attracted to very specific receptors for that spike protein that line the inside of every blood vessel in the body, and is also present in other tissues that I'll come to. That spike protein attaches to the inner side of those blood vessels, and that introduces what we call a coagulation cascade. It results in a thrombus, a blood clot, that may or may not completely obstruct that vessel. That is the reason why women are coming down with these rare blood clots in their brain, in the veins of the leg, and it quite likely explains the abnormal menstrual periods in women who've just been vaccinated, particularly those who are in the menopausal age group, because the expression of the ACE2 receptor in the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, increases with age. All that is the basic as we call pathophysiology, the mechanism by which the vaccine is intended to act, and the mechanism by which many of the adverse consequences take place. Yes, so that's a terribly important paper to show that this isn't just theory of the spike protein escaping into the blood in some people in significant amounts. It's now fact, and that adds one extra link in the pathway by which some of these complications can actually take place. And those complications, by the way, we're talking about essentially the gamut of them. Let's not forget that with the adverse reporting system that you have in the States, it's constantly increasing, but there are now about 4,000 deaths that have been attributed directly to the vaccination. That reporting system is full of loopholes. It's not necessarily that reliable, given how it's structured. But there again, you see, every time you turn around, there's a huge problem. If indeed, now over 6 months into this, if indeed the governments internationally, not just in the States, wanted to introduce a vaccine that is by any definition experimental and therefore unsafe, even if you accept that it was an emergency, which it's not, if you're doing that, then simultaneously you should have put in place the most thorough sampling of people who've been vaccinated to try to determine very quickly and with certainty what the complications were from the vaccination that could be verified as accurate and accumulate in statistics. They have not done that. And not just in the States, but it's not been done anywhere. That's a massive abrogation of their duty. If you're going to introduce something so risky for no reason at all, then at least put in place a system that monitors the complications of what you're doing. That has not happened. A good system. There is a system, but it's flawed. We will talk separately about the risk of fertility, which is, in my opinion, one of the biggest unknowns in this entire process. Because remember, this is an experimental vaccine that's introduced under emergency authorization, which the predicate of that, of course, is that this is an emergency. And by any definition, medically, this is not an emergency. And therefore, there is no justification to introduce a vaccine that is unsafe based upon that information. That is another hoax, if you like, to actually accelerate that reasoning, forgetting about the fact that it was never an emergency in the first place, despite what President Trump said. A little sidebar here. I am a Trumper, a fervent Trumper. I consider him to be a savior of democracy. The tragic that he lost the election. Regardless of that, on COVID, he was wrong multiple times. It's not a China virus. We'll talk about how it should really be called an American virus. Travel bans don't work. And because it was not an emergency, there was no need for warp speed research into creating this vaccine. If you're a big pharma and someone says to you, look, I'll give you a few $1 billion here to develop something that is a gift. When you start selling this stuff, you'll make billions of dollars for your company. And I'll also sweeten the pot by saying you're being given blanket immunity for any complications. What big pharma would not grab your hand off with free money, massive benefit, and no risk? That's sadly what's happened.
Let's talk about some of the dangers of this COVID-19 vaccine and its safety. As a medical professional, a scientist, is this vaccine safe?
That's another distortion of the English language. Everyone is using a word with 4 letters with no qualifications whatsoever. It's a grotesque lie. In medicine, we typically put vaccines through at least a 2 to 4 year trial period to see if something unexpected happens. It's the old saying of, you don't know what you don't know. You can't predict it, and that's why you do the trial, to see if unexpected things happen. And you categorize them, and you assemble them as a statistical assessment of if is the harm worse than the benefit. So it is not safe at all. How can it be if it's only been trialed for 6 months? Not only that, but it's a brand new technology, which should be given an even more thorough assessment of safety. But the thing that particularly worries me, and not as I'm not an anti-vax. Oh, let's lay a few things on the table. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in quackery of any kind. I'm a hardcore evidence-based physician who's lived his life true to that creed, as well as the Hippocratic Oath, and that we'll talk about in first do no harm. But this vaccine has gone, the safety of it, the trials have only gone on for 6 months. The only pregnant women that were included were those who got accidentally, unintentionally pregnant during the trial, and there are only 40 of those or so. Now, the last time I checked, pregnancy takes 9 months. How can you conceivably say a product is safe, quite apart from all these thrombotic blood coagulation abnormalities? How can you conceivably say that a product is safe from a fertility aspect if your trials have only gone on for 6 months? It's obviously ludicrous. It cannot have any meaning whatsoever to say it's safe. And when you actually look at the distribution of this receptor for the spike protein that we've discussed, other than the blood vessels, and by the way, platelets as well, the blood clotting little particles in the blood that are all to do with blood clotting and stopping you from bleeding. That receptor is also on the surface of platelets and may be responsible for some of the bleeding abnormalities that occur after vaccination. But the expression of this receptor, this ACE2 receptor, is also present in high concentration in the placenta and the testis, not the ovary, but the testis. So far as the placenta is concerned, if there were an attack on the placenta because of the spike protein attaching to these receptors, that could obviously result in miscarriage. That, sad as it is, might only be a one-time event. It's hard to postulate that it would be continual with subsequent pregnancies, although there are reasons why that could happen, and all the more reason to take it longer than 6 months. But what really worries me, without wishing to scare the population, is the reality that this receptor is present in the testis. And it's not just the testis, it's actually on the cells that produce spermatozoa. Now, obviously, you cannot test for that within 6 months. You have to go through quite a period of time looking at male fertility, spermatozoa counts, the success or not of pregnancy in women, couples who are trying to get pregnant. That obviously is going to take a few years. So why are we doing this? What if there's a plausible potential problem of that scale with those implications? Because an attack on the testis, for all we know, might not be a one-time thing, but could be sufficiently damaging to produce permanent male infertility or a significant reduction in fertility. And remember, that's at a time when there's an utterly unexplained, at the present time, drop in the concentration of spermatozoa, which over the last 10 or 20 years has been significant. About a 40% drop in spermatozoa is a well-documented phenomenon that is presently totally unexplained. Are we going to see another hit against male fertility with this vaccine? I sincerely hope not. And I hope this theory is just a hot air and has no confirmation, obviously. But it is a major risk. And I feel like banging the table here to get people to wake up, to realize what's at stake. This isn't just a trivial potential adverse effect. It could be catastrophic. And we just don't know. And yet we're injecting this into children as we speak, with the intent of bringing it down to 6 months of age for a condition that they're not going to die of. They'll shrug it off. It's of virtually no risk to them. And yet we're exposing them to all these risks of the vaccine. That just does not make any sense whatsoever. We must remember that every year, children die of the flu. Healthy children die of the flu every year. In this particular episode with COVID, fewer are dying of COVID than in previous years have died with the flu. So clearly, if there was no emergency with the flu, why is there suddenly an emergency with COVID for children? It doesn't make any sense. It's an arbitrary knee-jerk reaction by politicians who think they've got to wrestle this thing to the ground and have a zero COVID. And, you know, we have mutants popping up all over the place that have to be squished. No, why are we exposing children to this risk of vaccination? Remember, as I said, I am not an anti-vaxxer. I don't believe vaccines cause autism, for example. I take vaccines myself. They're very, very important in public health for measles and so on, polio, etc. Very, very important. But not this one. This one is unproven, high risk, unnecessary, and therefore reckless, particularly for children. And to be impotent at stopping that, it makes me angry and depressed every day to see this going on with no coordinated international response to try to stop it in its tracks. There are wonderful things going on in the States with various organizations, some of which have other agendas that sadly I disagree with. But there is an awful need to stop this attack on children. It's child abuse. And one of the things that can, as an individual level, attempt to stop it is what's called a notice of liability. It's illegal, it's cheap, it's immediate, and it's intimidating. It's not launching a civil suit. You're not suing anyone, but it can be a letter that's given to an individual that's trying to persuade your children to be vaccinated. School principals, school board members in particular, members of the colleges of physicians, not the members, the counselors, the people that sit on top of the registrars who are advocating supporting government actions here. A notice of liability is a legal document that puts people on notice that you cannot have the excuse of being ignorant of what you're doing if these terrible things happen. It has to be repeated. There's a very formal structure to it. But it will put these people who are supposed to be monitoring the activities of these various government bodies or school boards or health care systems, it will put them on notice that they are personally responsible for not corralling the activities of the people that are operationalizing this drive to vaccinate children. And it will give them, I would hope, a lot of second thoughts about their own personal exposure here if things go terribly sideways. Notice of liability. I urge everyone to explore that with your legal counsel, not just a letter writing campaign that you undertake, but it has to be formalized, and it's relatively inexpensive. It needs to have the evidence to support the reasoning behind it, which is widely available. And it's probably the most effective thing that individuals can do at this point in time to try and stop the train.
How does this vaccine impact the menstrual cycle and reproductive organs?
Well, this is where we get into theory as opposed to fact, but I think there's a plausible explanation. The lining of the uterus, the endometrium, as we call it in pathology, the endometrium is the lushest, most fragile tissue in the human body. And it's intentionally so, because that's where the fertilized ovum wants to sit and get buried and multiply. It's extremely fragile from a vascular perspective. The blood vessels are very, very fine. And it takes very, very little to change the vascular supply of the endometrium to make it slough, make it break down and produce a menstrual period. That's intentional. We want that endometrium to be a very receptive place for a fertilized ovum. And so that very fragility and the very how dependent it is upon an intact blood supply, I think you can see if the receptor for the spike protein is in the blood vessels within the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, it's quite plausible, in my opinion, that excess production of the spike protein in some women hones on the uterus, on the endometrium, causes the endometrium to slough off and create a period. To me, it's a very rational explanation. I'd love to see others that might be better explain it, but I think at the present time, that is the best explanation of what we're seeing. And hopefully, it's a one-time thing because the spike protein will disappear with time as it's cleared from the blood system. But we don't know. We don't know if that's the case. That's simply a hypothesis. All these things need to be tested. And it's not happening, and it usually does happen in a normal way in which vaccines are introduced into the population, but not this one. It would be understandable to bypass all those careful assessments if this was an international outbreak of Ebola. But it's not. It's nothing worse than a bad flu for the vast majority of people.
What about the variants? We hear a lot about the Indian variant or variants in the UK. Should people be concerned?
Not at all. That's another scare tactic. These viruses are what we call RNA viruses, which means it's not DNA. It's a different version, if you like. But one main characteristic of RNA is that it is a very fragile chemical structure. It breaks down rapidly, but they also mutate rapidly. these RNA viruses because they got a very poor check on their copying mechanism. It's random, it's not intentional. Viruses don't think. There's just inaccurate copying as they multiply. And a very small number of those mutations turn out to still be a viable virus. Those mutations, though, take place over a very, very short segment of the entire viral genome. And it's no more usually than 3% of the structure that changes. The big point to realize is that our immune system is so unbelievably efficient that it will still pick up the principal genome of the coronavirus, even if it's changed by 3%. Our immune system will still pick up the fact that this is something to be attacked and killed. And indeed, there's studies coming out now, post-vaccination, unfortunately, that are showing that these vaccines are effective against most of these variants. Entirely predictable. It's now being shown to be the case. But there's a much bigger point than this. They're using the word variant or mutant or double mutant. Some of these viruses, by the way, have 11 mutations, not just a double mutation. I mean, it's constant, it's predictable. It happens all the time with RNA viruses. That's why we have a different flu vaccine every year, because they've mutated while we've been waiting. You can never get ahead of RNA viruses. They will always mutate. So that's the position on variants. That's where I was going. So let's say one of these variants might be shown to be more transmissible. I say that's a good thing, not a bad thing, not to be scared of. Simply because increased transmissibility means that more people will get this condition the natural way, and the working world will not die of that. And that is a good thing. It builds immunity the natural way against the whole virus, not just a bit of it. It's cheap, it's immediately available. It's called ordinary living, hugging, touching, shaking hands, working in the same environment, taking the Russian roulette of getting it unavoidably, as we did with the flu. So mutants are again being vamped up as another scare tactic, when in fact it's the natural course of RNA infections. Utterly predictable and nothing to be scared of. In fact, almost to be encouraged.
Let's talk about medical ethics here. You have stated in the past that this is politics playing medicine, which is a very dangerous game. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that?
Everyone should stick to their knitting. We're talking here about science and ethics, not about breastbeating politicians wrestling this to the ground and taking the kudos for it. No, we're talking about some very basic things here. The two principal medical ethics that are relevant to this COVID pandemic are the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, and secondly, informed consent. Now, first do no harm. The consequences of lockdowns are monstrous, quantifiable. The deaths that they're causing, the stress that they're causing, the consequences for the last contact with a dying relative. I spoke to a woman some time ago because of death threats I've been getting. We got into a personal conversation, and she was from Victim Services, and she called me to try and make sure I was all right, but we got talking personally because her accent revealed that she grew up near I did in Britain. So we started talking personally. And she told me this, the worst thing I've ever heard in my entire career. She told me that she was not allowed to hold the hand of her dying father. Now, it doesn't get worse than that when the jackboots of the state are in your face at that very tender, such a poignant moment, to prevent that from happening without any rationale whatsoever. The consequences of that, closing churches, putting fences around churches, as we're seeing up here in Alberta in Canada, denying people to worship for the most ridiculous reasons, funerals being delayed, graduations cancelled, homeschooling hopelessly inadequate, a tsunami of healthcare issues are piling up to be handled that have not been handled because of people fearful of going to hospital or doctors, or hospitals saying we can't do it because we've got to keep all these beds closed in case there's Armageddon coming. There will be enormous consequences. Cancer diagnoses not made, cancer treatments not happening. A million ways in which these lockdowns are hurting people. So that's the first medical ethic. First, do no harm. The second one is informed consent, and we've partially covered that. These vaccines are not safe by any normal, traditional definition. And the people that are saying so are enormously culpable by saying that knowingly, telling people that it is safe when it's obviously not. I mean, we're seeing these complications already being documented, admittedly in low numbers, but the deaths, 4,000 in the States, attributed to the vaccination, massively increased relative to previous vaccination programs. These numbers can't be ignored. So all the colleges of physicians who are constantly attacking physicians with licenses, instead of attacking physicians such as myself for standing up and saying these things, I would say this publicly to all those colleges. Your job is to protect the public good. It's not to be the enforcer of government policy. Yes, you do weed out the pedophiles and the doctors who are having sex with patients and cutting off the wrong leg and all that kind of stuff. Yes, you do all of that. But if something as gross as this is happening on your watch, with so much harm being done, and with no informed consent, especially for vaccination in children, it is your job as colleges monitoring the profession to demand of government and the medical officers who are behind these government decisions. You should be banging the table, demanding of them, why are you doing this? What is the evidence? I can tell you, at least in Canada, that's been demanded of these ministries, and they've come up with these pathetic delays, despite being a year into this game, of saying that they need more time. They desperately want to avoid going to court because they know, as we know, that there is no evidence for doing these things. They're arbitrary, knee-jerk reactions by politicians playing medicine, simply for their own bravado, what they think is the macho appeal at the next election to show I'm a strong leader that's protecting you from Armageddon. They need to be brought to task. These individual physicians in the ministries and departments of health in the States are practicing medicine on society and should be called to a much higher level of standard of care than ordinary physicians on practicing on one patient, particularly as this is a new technology. They're hiding behind what they think is the immunity from prosecution by virtue of being in a bureaucracy and therefore protected. But they've got a big surprise coming their way, because that's not a blanket immunity that covers everything. They are personally culpable for the deaths and destruction that is happening on such an incredible scale. So that's my feeling about medical ethics. It's tragic. The physicians individually are not standing up, but they're not standing up because of the intimidation that their colleges are communicating to them. They said very, very clearly in my own college, and I could almost repeat it verbatim. They've said this: be very, very careful. That's subtext for "we're watching you," by the way. Be very, very careful. What you say is based on fact and not hearsay. Now, that is the most Orwellian threat you could imagine, because everything that's being done is based on hearsay. It's not based on fact. It's exactly the other way around. And my college in Alberta actually went on to say that, as if that wasn't bad enough, they actually went on to say, and do not discuss this with your neighbors. Can you see how intimidating this is?
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you about this because you have spoken up about this crisis and you have been countering the official narrative. How has this impacted your life?
Well, there's a process that's underway that may or may not be complete. I don't know. You have to wait for the next letter to see how they're going to morph their accusations and demands for you justifying what you're saying. I very much hope this will go to court, because it will not, because no one wants to be shown to be, they don't want to be shown to be wrong, because it would be case law and a precedent that all physicians would shake in front of their faces to say, did you see that court case where you were told you had no right to intimidate physicians, their freedom of speech and their own commitment to ethics to their patients as opposed to their commitment to government. So that's a process that's underway with me. It's intended to intimidate. It's intended to bankrupt you, because if they choose at the end of the day to take your license away, you have to fight to get it back, which is incredibly expensive. And so it's like the Star Chamber of the Middle Ages, as opposed to the normal court. With these colleges, you are guilty until proven innocent. A total reversal of the onus of proof. That's what they intimidate with. They're very reluctant to push it to the extreme. They hope that the intimidation will be sufficient to shut you up. But as I said, isn't it absolutely awful that a body that's supposed to protect the public good has become, in essence, the enforcer of government desire?
So, just to be clear here, the scientists and the doctors who are speaking out against the official narrative are being threatened and they're receiving death threats?
Yes. The death threats are, of course, not coming from government or the colleges.
Right.
But they might as well be a death threat because it's called your livelihood. No, there's all kinds of internet warriors who make these ridiculous threats that, are just obviously hot air. You take it seriously. You take your own precautions. But it's not that really, so much as the censorship that's going on is, of course, one of the principal reasons people are so ill-informed about what's happening. The censorship is brutal, it's international, it's incredibly efficient across all the three levels where most people would go for information: journalism, politicians, and physicians. We talked about physicians. Politicians are being threatened, at least in Canada, being kicked out of the party if you dare to stand up and question the rationale of what's happening. And the media are also being intimidated. Well, the mainstream media, of course, is full of wokeism and are tripping over themselves to support government. Certainly in Canada, where the media are being basically bribed into silence by the Prime Minister doling out huge globs of money to them. You don't bite the hand that feeds you, do you? But the independent media, such as yourself, every single interview I've ever given that got posted on YouTube has been taken down within minutes internationally, no matter whichever country I've been interviewed. So that's a source of livelihood for these independent journalists that's being denied them. And so they get taken out of the picture. I mean, yeah, okay, so you can post it on Rumble and BitChute and all that. Yeah, great. Okay, it's getting through to some people, but nowhere near the reach that would otherwise be the case. So the average person has been kept totally ignorant of any information that would be counter to the narrative that governments are imposing on citizens internationally. That's why we're in this mess, because of censorship and fear driven by asymptomatic testing and this lousy PCR test. I'd like to talk about PCR, by the way, later on.
Yes, please do. Let's talk about the PCR test and its efficiency.
It's a lousy test that was never intended for large-scale testing. It creates a huge number of false positives for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which is when, having run big labs, I can tell you, if I walked in one morning and my COO said to me, "Hey, Dr. Hodkinson, you know what? We've had 1,000 times more requests for serum rhubarb today than yesterday. What the hell are we going to do?" Well, we'd pull people off other sections of the lab, put them in front of boxes with buttons on them, give them a short training, and tell them to push those buttons. Well, for serum rhubarb, it would be fairly straightforward because there's a kit, and it would be very simple to press the buttons. But it's a totally different story when you're doing molecular diagnostics with PCR. You have to train people with minute attention to detail, not just for how they do the test, but to avoid cross-contamination between samples and indeed the whole laboratory. So it's a lousy test. It has a huge number of false positives. But that's beside the point. It wasn't necessary. It had no purpose, even if it was 100% accurate. Who cares if I'm carrying a strand of RNA virus in my nose? If I'm not sick, who cares? We know it's everywhere. So what? You're not going to treat me. All you're going to do is quarantine me and all my contacts and take out a whole team of people at work or in the restaurant and therefore close down an economy. For what purpose? There is no purpose. The only place where testing should take place is where it normally takes place. And that is if you're so sick that you go to hospital because you can't breathe, you've got a fever, you're coughing, and it could be COVID. That's where you need to be tested. And when you're tested in that location, you need to be tested with a much more accurate method that's called sequencing. It's called Sanger sequencing because Dr. Sanger got the Nobel Prize for it. It's how the Genome Project was done. And it's not only accurate, but it's verifiably accurate. Whereas PCR conceptually simply has a light bulb attached to a molecule and the light bulb goes off and you'd no idea if the light bulb has gone off because of a true positive or a false positive. Whereas with sequencing, you have incontrovertible proof that a positive is positive. Now, that technology is well known. It's been around for a long time. It's easy to scale up at the volume that's needed for the much reduced number of people who are presenting sick at hospital. It's not being done, and that's another reason why they're culpable. The technology is well known. It's scalable to the volume of testing that would be needed at the point of admission to hospital. And they're not doing it on a routine basis. They're only doing it to try and identify these so-called variants. I used to be, for the very college that's got its teeth in my backside, I used to be a laboratory accreditation inspector. I had the right, I visited laboratories and examined the books and had the right to shut them down. Now, if I had walked into a laboratory and I was looking at their pap smear results, screening for cervical cancer, and knowing full well that very few would be positive, if I saw that that lab was reporting 70% pap smears as positive for cancer, I would shut that lab down that afternoon. Boom. Obviously, grotesquely bad laboratory. What's the difference now? People walking around with stuff in their nose, feeling perfectly well, are being now labeled as infectious, a case that needs to be quarantined, when it's no such thing. As likely as not, most of them don't even have a strand of that virus in their nose. 90% false positives. And even if the 10% of them do, so what? Can you see the disparity here? In a time called BC, which by the way, is before COVID, in a long time ago, called the time called BC, those kinds of screening assessments would go on all the time. The value of the test, how wrong it is, how often it's wrong, and is that worth the fear that's created, and so on. That's a normal part of the practice of laboratory medicine that I spent my entire life in. But this time it's being contorted in a totally bizarre way to support these ridiculous, arbitrary reactions by government who haven't a clue what they're doing. It's politics playing medicine. Do you want the governor of one of your states to open up your belly if you've got a hot appendix? No, stick to your knitting. You know, we're talking serious medicine here. We know what we're talking about if you'll just take the muzzles off us and let us speak.
What about asymptomatic spread? Is there any scientific basis for that?
No. No evidence for it of any significance whatsoever, particularly with children. But you've got to look, lay people listening. When you've got an infection, it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that you've got a lot of bugs causing it? You know, that's the reason you're sick, you've got pneumonia, you've got a sore throat, whatever. You've got a lot of bugs causing it, because if there weren't that many bugs, it wouldn't have caused something that you were aware of. So if you're not feeling sick, even if you have this virus in your nose, you're obviously not, statistically speaking, going to be spreading it, because there's not much of that in your snot, right? It just couldn't happen. Intuitively. It's now been shown, as if you had to prove it, it's now been shown that that is the case, that asymptomatic spread, realistically speaking, does not occur at any significant volume to warrant these interventions that are killing society at so many levels. No, it's another whack-a-mole argument. You know, you bang one down here and another three pop up there. It's a never-ending whack-a-mole game with government. They're always inventing new things to be fearsome of, to be afraid of, like mutants, for example. Hiding the data, morphing the data, sleight of hand, false positives that they know about. Di-da. When I'm asked at the end of many presentations I've made, do you want to say anything finally? I say, don't believe anything you're told. It's a pack of lies. It's a pack of lies. There's some truth out there, but it's grossly distorted. And you need to form your own opinion, hopefully with information such as I'm talking about now, and from others. Fox News, has gone public with a lot of things about Fauci and how his fingerprints are all over this. The way the genetic engineering took place in Wuhan. We could talk about that if you want.
Would you like to speak about that?
I think it's very important to try and get a grip on how this thing started and follow the dots. Flip-flop Fauci, that arrogant little blank, 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 right, who's totally out of his depth. He wanted to do what's called gain of function on coronavirus. With the gain of function is this bizarre concept that by making something intentionally more infectious, that you can study it to better understand how it spreads and how to treat it. Gain of function research. Obama has said we're not going to allow that in the States, and so Fauci intentionally bypassed that by offloading it to what you might call a white-gloved intermediary to sanitize it, who immediately subcontracted the work, and Fauci knew that this would happen, to the lab in Wuhan. Fauci funded gain of function research on the coronavirus in the lab in Wuhan. The paper trail is there for everyone to see. This isn't conspiracy theory. And so they did that research, genetic engineering, making that virus more infectious. And in all probability, I'm not saying that this was intentional at all. That would be a very ludicrous conspiracy theory to think that there was some Machiavellian intent to release this virus. No, that didn't happen. It was a lab notorious for its biosafety record. State Department communiques documenting it previously. He still sent it there. I mean, if that wasn't supremely idiotic in the first place, knowing that this research was going on in a lab that couldn't be trusted. So like any lab that's doing biosafety work, you can never, ever, ever, even in the States, Fort Derrick, Porton Down in Britain, you can never, ever be 100.00000% confident that an escape will never happen because of the human factor. It always will, and hopefully you can contain it. In my opinion, as a result of that research, a pair of dirty shoes walked out of that lab one day, got going in the local environment as an epidemic, not a pandemic, and was rapidly in Milan because there was very frequent travel between Wuhan and Milan simply because of the needs of the Italian leather industry for cheap Chinese labor. So it came into Milan, which has the highest density of elderly people in the whole of Europe. So before anyone knew what was going on, the virus that was causing an epidemic in Wuhan, unbeknown to the Chinese, was on flights internationally, but particularly to Milan, because a lot of Chinese were working in the Italian leather industry there as cheap labor, and it got going in Milan. Now, Milan, unfortunately, has the highest density of elderly people in nursing homes in all of Europe. And so, if you like, they were sitting ducks. They started dying in relatively large numbers, and that got to the attention of an idiot at Imperial College London called Neil Ferguson. Neil Ferguson is not an epidemiologist or physician. Neil Ferguson happens to be a theoretical physicist by training, who was notorious with previous epidemics of miscalling the projections by orders of magnitude. Despite his notoriously bad reputation, he modeled those numbers in Milan into the most extravagant projections. and Armageddon was coming. He published that. The media, of course, gorges on crises. It sells advertising. And it was everywhere in the world the next morning. So everyone in a position of power, control, reputation, re-election possibilities was faced with a dilemma. What the hell are we going to do with this train coming down the tracks with our name on it? And so the order went out. Listen, I don't care what it is. I want on my desk tomorrow morning, read my lips, something that's visible, that everyone can see. I, your all protector, I'm doing something to protect you from Armageddon. And all they could come back with were these arbitrary measures which are known not to work. But the boss was demanding something from a political perspective. And so that's how this whole mess got started. And of course, it got worse and worse because the first rule in politics is you never apologize, you never back down, you simply morph the game. And of course, the game has been meticulously morphed as we've gone along. So that's how the whole thing started. Rather than calling it a China virus, as I said, it could probably be better called a made in America virus, because Fauci's fingerprints are all over this. And he had the gall to stand in front of a camera on, as Fox was showing a couple of nights ago, to stare straight at the camera and said, I did not fund gain of function research at the Wuhan lab. Well, that's been meticulously lawyered. He's the walking dead right now, because he's largely, if you wanted to put your finger on one person that's responsible for this, it's not the Chinese government, it's one Dr. Fauci.
What would have been the appropriate response to COVID-19?
It became very clear very quickly that the working well were not dying. That's when the restrictions should have been lifted immediately. That's what prompted the Great Barrington Declaration to say the solution is focused protection, not to involve the whole of the economy, all the other demographics. We need to be going overboard on protecting the elderly by means that are well known, that don't actually need a vaccine. They're called infection control manuals. They're on the shelves getting dusty. It's how we control superbugs in hospitals. Well-known methodologies. Staff training, vitamin D supplementation, because people in nursing homes, they never go outside. They're all, by definition, vitamin D deficient. And they should all have been given and should still be given vitamin D supplements every day, at least 5,000 international units, totally non-toxic, proven to be efficacious, as a very important additional way to protect them. But let's remember that so many of these people, sadly, it's not callous to say so, they're very close to the end of life. And from a medical perspective, we don't really understand the word fragility. It's not just that our heart isn't pumping as well and our lungs are not as good, but our immune system is not as good. And so it takes the merest brush on the cheek from someone that's on the cusp of dying from malignancy or heart disease or whatever. It takes a very little additional stress on the body to result in a death spiral that, from a medical perspective, it's so complicated, we don't understand it. I mean, if you take away daily contact from people with Alzheimer's, they'll die faster, for example. Yeah, so that's how the whole mess started. That's how it got going. That's the realization of it not killing the working well was known very quickly. But politicians would not back down from the arbitrary measures that their subordinates would have told them there's no evidence for this working, but they felt they had to be seen to be doing something.
For people who are watching right now who are very concerned about their future, what do you suggest they do to ensure that we do not continue down this path?
Well, you can, of course, vote at the next election, but that's some time away in various places. There's a very important threatening device that is cheap and immediate and threatening. And that's called a notice of liability, in which, in appropriately structured legal language, you send a letter to school principals, to school board members, to members of the colleges, physicians, to employers, that says simply this: listen, we don't like what you're forcing us to undertake, this vaccine, as a condition of returning to work or to school or whatever. We're not going to do that because we think it's very, very dangerous. And if you go to the extreme of denying me employment or my child's education, we are putting you on notice that we're going to sue you. And especially if there are complications, if in fact I get vaccinated or my child gets vaccinated because of your insistence and threats and all the consequences that you're proposing, and we do actually follow through with that vaccination, and terrible things happen, we are putting you here and now on notice. You cannot claim ignorance as your defense. That's called a notice of liability. It's intended to intimidate as the initial salvo. It's very difficult now for board members to get insurance against liability. It used to be fairly common, but it's so expensive now that many organizations go naked into the night. They don't have it. And so that would give a lot of food for thought for the people who are supposed to be responsible for the governorship, for the governing of these various organizations. The other thing that individuals can do, of course, is take vitamin D, which is overwhelming evidence for its effectiveness at preventing or minimizing COVID-19. 5,000 international units, cheap, non-toxic, immediately available. You can't get your hands on ivermectin yet without that's probably going to be shown to be effective with the trials that are underway. Tess Lawrie, of course, is the principal proponent of that, a very educated lady who has come out strongly advocating for it, in addition to Dr. Corrie, of course, in the States, with his powerful testimony before the Senate. There's not much individuals can do other than that. You can visit your politicians, you can pound the table, you can demand of them, ask your government, why are you doing this? What is the evidence that you think supports these terrible interventions, which are so harmful and so risky? I can't think of anything else that an individual could be expected to do.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with us today about COVID-19 or the vaccines?
I think the best way to end is how I started. Nothing works. Nothing could work. Nothing did work. Nothing will work. We have to accept that medicine is impotent. And this whole matter could be so well handled by personal responsibility as we've done with previous flu epidemics. It's really no different from that experience, except older people being slightly more vulnerable. And that too can be managed very effectively. Don't believe what you're being told. It's a pack of lies from start to finish that's intended to make you fearful and compliant. So stand up, be vocal, and try to act in your own environment as forcibly as you can.
Very well said. Dr. Roger Hodkinson, thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, Taylor.
Absolutely, thank you. And I want to thank you all for watching this video. Please remember that the doctors we speak with on this channel put their careers and their personal lives at a tremendous risk in order to provide us with the truth, the science, and the facts surrounding COVID-19. So please share this with everyone you know, share it with your friends and your family, and all over your social media to get the word out. I want to thank you guys again for watching. While you're at it, don't forget to like this video and also subscribe to The Last American Vagabond. I'm independent journalist Taylor Hudak, and I'll see you guys next time.